Perfect. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the special JLI Book Smart. And hopefully you have your timeline. And if you don't, it's fine because we're going to have slides of it up here. Let me just make sure that I have it going. Okay. Well, there's some more people coming in. So last week we started with the question of what defines Torah. And we discussed the fact that there are two parts to the Torah. There are many parts, but in general terms, there's what's referred to as the written Torah, and then there's the oral Torah. The written Torah has three distinct sections to it, which we discussed last week. The first one is Torah, which has the 5 books of Moses, and then you have the prophets, and then you have the scriptures, which make up 24 books. We also spoke about the oral Torah. The oral Torah has many parts to it as well. And we had a special JLI class over the years that discussed the oral Torah in detail, not the books of the oral Torah as we're going to do now, but rather what defines something as the oral Torah. And the oral Torah, basically, just to remind you, has three columns. One is what was received from Moses. That's the narrative. The other one is what's derived, that the sages were able to derive from the verses. And the third one are the instituted edicts. Now, we're not going to talk about the specific 3. We're going to talk about the formulation of oral Torah and many books. And I'm sure when I'm going to mention names of books, you will recognize it. Now, the most famous part of the oral Torah, which is not only the most famous part, but it's the most authentic part of the oral Torah, is something we refer to as the Talmud. Talmud comes from the word limud, to study, to learn. The Talmud is undefinable. In other words, it has so many pieces to it, and it has so many dimensions to it, that it's very difficult to define what it is. And actually, in the class that we have tonight, we're not going to be speaking so much about the Talmud. We're going to be speaking about something that is in the realm of the Talmud, but it has its own distinct characteristic, and that is called the Midrash. I'm sure many of you have heard the Midrash. I'm sure you listened to a nice sermon, and the rabbi would say, there is a beautiful Midrash that I would like to quote. What is this Midrash? What are these books of the Midrash? And how many authors are there to the Midrash? And what role does Midrash play in Judaism, and what's its real purpose? Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about the Midrash, and some people think that it's all about parables. Some people think it's allegories. Some people think it's just imagination or hocus pocus. All kinds of stuff that people think. Tonight, hopefully, after we finish this particular lesson, you'll have a much better understanding in what the meaning of the Midrash is. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But the Talmud runs parallel to the Midrash. The Talmud is composed of the Mishnah, which was written by the Tanoim, which is the first recorded book of Jewish law. And it has 6 orders to it. And then the Gemara, which makes up the bulk of the Talmud, is the exploration of the meaning of the Mishnah. Next week, we will cover the Talmud more in detail. Another thing that we're going to cover next week is, if it's considered to be the oral Torah, that it was handed down from generation to generation, why was it written down? Why was it recorded? So I'm not going to jump to that answer now. We'll leave it for next week. But what I do want to talk about is the concept of Midrash. We're going to go back to the previous slide soon, but I want to go into what Midrash is. The question about Midrash, if you look on the slide, is it a particular book or a series of books? Is it a certain style of teaching? And the answer is it's both. It's not only one book, but there's a whole series of books. And is it a certain style of teaching? Yes. I'm going to go back to this slide here. If you give a look at the timeline, you will see that there are 2 kinds of Midrashim. Whatever we have above the line in red is considered to be halachic midrash, Whatever we have gold and below is considered to be Agadic Midrash. So we'll discuss that soon and in more detail. But let's talk about the word Midrash. What does Midrash mean? The word Midrash comes from the word drash. Now, contrary to what some people think, that drash just means giving a lecture, the truth of the matter is that drash is not about lecture. Drash means to seek. We find that when God is commanding the judges of the Supreme Court of Israel, of the Sanhedrin, that when they have to deal with a case, it says, V'chakarta v'darashta. V'chakarta means you should research it. V'darashta means that you shall seek it out. So the word drash, which that makes up the meaning of midrash, is not about a parable. It's not about a story. It's not about a nice speech that someone said, I heard a nice sermon. Drash is really exposition, to seek out. That's the meaning of drash. Drosh. We also find it in the very beginning of Genesis. After Cain killed Abel, God made the commandment not to kill another human being. And he says that if someone kills another human being, I will seek out his blood. In other words, I will seek out his murderers. And the word there is edrosh, which comes from the word drash. Again, so midrash means to seek out the inner meaning. So when we talk about midrash in the oral Torah, and by the way, the midrash did not come before the Talmud, because we spoke about the Talmud before. The Talmud came before the midrash. Midrash, in other words, Talmud was they started to write the Talmud before the midrash. The only reason that we are exploring midrash before we're exploring Talmud, which we're going to do next week, is because the Talmud that we're going to be exploring deals mainly with Jewish law. And the follow-up lesson that's going to be after the Talmudic study is going to be halacha, which is Jewish law. So we're going to actually try to examine what the meaning of midrash is. Just another few slides. Is Rabbi Cohen out there? Been seeing? Okay. One more note before we go into the text. If you remember last week, I'm waiting for everybody to come because we really want to get into this. And it's important to try to be on time because the beginning really sets the tone for it. We mentioned last week that everything is contained in the Torah. Please look at this slide. Just as the entire human being is encoded in a strand of DNA, so does a midrashic teaching expound on the layers and meaning encoded in every word and verse written in the Torah. So I'm going to give you a little example about this. Let's say a person has lived in the middle of America, and all they've seen is the flats of Kansas. They've never seen the mountains, they've never seen the ocean. And somebody offers them a trip to the coast. They come to the coast and they can't get over the vastness of the ocean. The ocean is not a lake, the ocean is big. And if they're down in Miami and they take a little boat ride, they even see the dolphins doing some dances. And they're just very taken by that. They're very impressed with it. Wow, they'll see the ocean. But does that truly mean that the people experienced the ocean, that they went swimming in the ocean a little bit, or they took a ride in the ocean, they sailed over the ocean? Anyone that went deep sea diving knows that it's not so. Because as much as there's life that comes up, that bubbles up on the ocean, there is even much more of marine life that's hidden. When you study Torah, of course, the first approach of studying Torah is to understand it in its most simple, straightforward way, to understand the translation, the interpretation of the words, to understand what the commentaries say in the simplest meaning. Without that, you can't get anywhere. It's the first base that you have to reach. After that, you start seeking a little bit more. You start looking under the cover, so to speak. You start looking under the layers. And when you look under the layers, you start revealing a whole new concept of Torah that you've never seen before. Now, I mentioned before that the main part of the Talmud is made up of Mishnah and Gemara. Mishnah is the same letters as Neshama. So whenever we get together to learn, we have to have in mind not only our Neshama, but the Neshamas that passed away as well. So I'm going to mention a few things. First of all, tonight is the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who fought for the freedom of the Jews in the Soviet Union with self-sacrifice. So we remember him. 2 days ago was the yahrzeit of a very dear friend of ours who would celebrate every year Tishrei and Nisan in Charlotte, Rabbi Yudi Dukes. And the yahrzeit was commemorated on the 8th day of Shvat. We're also in the year of mourning of people that are beloved to us. And I know Roman is here, so I'm thinking about Brett. And her Hebrew name was Sarah Naomi ben Simcha Reuven. So we have them all in mind. So when you study Torah, it causes an aliyah for the neshama. Okay. I'm going to skip the timeline for now, but I want to go into the concept of Midrash. And by the way, this comes as a surprise to most people. In fact, the comments that I hear most since I have moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1980 is derogatory comments about the Midrash. And I'm sorry to say that. People say, oh, that's a Midrash. That's not from the Torah. It's something that rabbis made up. The truth of the matter is that it's totally not so. The Midrash was narrated by the rabbis, but it reveals insights, and we're going to have some examples of it. But when we look at Midrash, we're going to see that there's two categories of Midrash. The first category of Midrash, Shlomo, does someone have a book? Or do we have any extra? Someone, do you have a book?
I have it for him.
He'll bring you the book. So the first category of Midrash is what we refer to as halachic Midrashim. Halachic Midrashim, they are the mitzvot that are derived from the word. So we're going to have some examples of how halacha, which is Jewish law, is derived from a verse, and that is what's called halachic Midrashim. A lot of it will be spent on it next week when we study more of the Talmud. But then there is another part, which that is the famous part of the Midrash, which is called Agadic Midrashim. The word Agada is Aramaic for the word Haggadah. Are you familiar with the word Haggadah? What does Haggadah mean? Haggadah people relate to Pesach, but what does Haggadah mean? To relate, to tell the story. To tell the story, it says V'higada to Lavincha that you have to tell the story of Passover. Agadic Midrashim are stories that we find in the Midrash, which encompass both the moral, the philosophical, the mystical teachings, and it comes through stories, parables, and narratives. And we're going to have some examples in our class tonight. So for that reason, when we talk about Midrash, Midrash is not something which is something that accompanies the Torah, but it actually reveals the inner mechanism of the Torah on a fantastic way. So there are types of Midrashim. You'll see there's some Midrashim which are legal exposition. They reveal to us the legal terms of Torah. Some of them have historical narratives, which will give you some examples. Some of them have moral and ethical lessons. Some of them are philosophical. Some of them are just simple parables, but the parable is to convey a story. Some of them is just Torah commentary, and some tells us the lives of the sages. I'm going to give you an example soon of one of the stories that we find in the Midrash, which without it, we wouldn't be able to understand what it means. If you look on page 60, you will see figure number 2.1. I want you to look at it for a minute. It's very important to look in your book right now, because you have the halachic midrashim, which that's the legal part. For instance, if you watch people put on tefillin, we know that the tefillin has to be put on the head, on the hand. But how do we know that it has to be put on the forehead and not between the eyes? How do we know that we don't put it on the palm of the hand and we put it on the arm opposite the heart? That is all from the Midrash. And that is legal because that is the way we actually observe the ritual, as we will see it detailed. Similarly with the mezuzah, to know how the mezuzah should be written. Then there are historical narrations. When you look at the story of Abraham, for instance, the story of Abraham starts in the Torah just when God revealed himself to him and said, Abraham, go from your land, from your birthplace to the land that I'll show you. But it doesn't say anything about his childhood, his exploration of God. All of that is from the Midrash. There are also moral and ethical things about the power of speech, philosophical, and so on and so forth. I don't have to go through all of it, but Midrash encompasses it all. So how's the Midrash organized? How's the Midrash and how many books are there? You have a timeline and you have many sheets, but JLI makes it easy. So just as we had a video last week, which described the 24 books, we are going to describe the books of Midrash and when they were written and how they were written, but this does not include the Talmud. That we will do next week. Please pay attention.
Welcome to the branch of Torah study known as Midrash. Midrash comes from the Hebrew verb drush, to seek out or expound. It refers to the effort to explore, explain, and expound on the Torah. It is also the title of an entire genre of literature generated by Mishnaic and Talmudic sages, the phenomenal Jewish scholars who lived roughly between 100 and 500 CE. Midrashic literature comes in two forms. One, halachic. These works document the intricate methods used to analyze the typically terse biblical texts containing the Torah's 613 commandments. The goal of a halachic midrash is to show how the detailed laws governing the practical observance of those commandments are derived. Two, agadic. These works provide a wealth of explanation of biblical texts and narratives, parables that clarify or illustrate a point, moral and ethical teachings, philosophical insights, mystical traditions, historical narratives, and background information not explicitly recorded in the biblical text, and stories from the lives of the ancient sages. Much midrashic material was lost in the upheavals of Jewish history, but the surviving works form a library of their own. Here are the major midrashic works still in existence, including later era anthologies in chronological order. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer explores the biblical events from the creation until the Jewish journey through the Sinai desert. It is attributed to one of the Mishnah's most prominent sages, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael preserves expositions on the book of Exodus that were taught in the academy of Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. Mechilta de Rashbi offers expositions on the book of Exodus from an alternative academy, that of the much beloved Rabbi Akiva. Its recording is attributed to his disciple, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous author of the mystical Zohar. Seder Olam, meaning world chronology, chronicles biblical and post-biblical history from creation until the 2nd century Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans. It is attributed to Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta of Sepphoris. Sifra provides key expositions on Leviticus, which focus on Kohanim, Jewish priests who served in the temple. The work is also called Torat Kohanim, the laws of the priests. Its partner volumes on the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy are known collectively as Sifri. The insights in these volumes were taught by the school of Rabbi Yehuda, a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Maimonides identifies the Talmudic sage Rav as the compiler of Sifra and Sifri. Midrash Rabbah is a series of 10 separate works that provide textual expositions, historical narratives, and moral teachings structured as commentaries on the 5 books of Moses and the 5 scriptural scrolls: Song of Songs, Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. These anthologies were compiled between the 3rd and 12th centuries and record teachings of Talmudic sages from the land of Israel from the 3rd and 4th centuries. Midrash Tanchuma is a foundational book offering expositions on the 5 books of Moses. It is named after a 4th century author heavily quoted in the work, Rabbi Tanchuma. The Talmud is not an exclusively midrashic work, but its legions of volumes include a vast treasury of halachic and agadic midrashic material. Midrash Tehillim offers commentary on the Book of Psalms. Its era of compilation is unknown, but it is cited in works as early as the 11th century. Yalkut Shmoni, a voluminous midrashic anthology covering all 24 books of Tanakh, was compiled by Rabbi Shimon HaDarshan of Frankfurt, Germany. Midrash Hagadol is an anthology attributed to Rabbi David Bar Amram Al-Adani of Yemen. Ein Yaakov, an extraction of the Agadic sections of the Talmud, was compiled by Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib of Spain and Greece. The sheer number of surviving midrashic works spanning 15 centuries testifies to the Jewish scholar's remarkable commitment to identifying and expounding the wisdom and guidance contained in God's Torah.
So basically, the Midrash wasn't written by, by authors who came up with their own ideas. The Midrash was a recording, of teachings that was handed down from generation to generation. Yes.
I have a question here too. You said some midrashic words are lost, right? So my question first is, how many major and minor midrashic works would fit into this bookshelf? Number one. And number two, if I were an archaeologist and find something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, would that today recognize as a midrashic work?
So let me answer. The first question is that the original midrashic is not as vast as the Talmud. The Talmud is 63 volumes, but the midrashic is bigger than what we have today. Today we have very few that survived from the original. Secondly, if we would find midrashic scrolls, we would have to authenticate it in order to be able to say that it's real. And that would be by looking at other midrashim that would quote it, see the style of writing, and with a lot of research, we would be able to see whether it's something that is from which sources they are. Because the same thing happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We basically know where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, and it's even by examining the Hebrew and examining the extra letters that they have that we have been able to figure out where the Dead Sea Scrolls come from. But the point of the matter is that Midrash is not something that rabbis decided, like when he quoted the Frankfurt, Germany, or later in Spain, it wasn't that they were writing their own. They collected, like the Yalkut Shimoni means the collection that they took from various sources of Midrashim and reprinted it so it should be easier, or the Ein Yaakov as well. The question is, why are these Midrashic things so necessary? We know that the Torah is called the orchard of the Torah, Pardes HaTorah. The word Pardes has 4 letters, and each of the letter indicates another layer of understanding the Torah. The first is Pshat, which is the simple, straightforward meaning. Then there's the Remez. Remez is what is hidden in a hint of the Torah. It could be in a gematria, which is a numerical value, or things of that nature. And then you have the drash, the dalid, which is the drash. Drash is seeking out what is the story behind the story, what are the layers behind it, and what was handed down from Sinai. Then you have the samach, which is the sod, which is the mystical. So drash is very important in order to be able to understand what was really behind it. And the midrash actually, as you see, it started about 100 BCE and it was closed to 500 CE, which is basically the lifespan of the Talmud, although the Mishnah started 200 BCE. Now, if you didn't remember everything that it says on the video, by the way, you have on page 62 the outline of all these midrashim and when they were printed and when they were brought to light. Okay. Now, we mentioned earlier that for 1,200 years following the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the oral Torah was transmitted orally from generation to generation. And we mentioned last week, if you remember, that we read a quote that it says that it was prohibited to, Shlomo, do you mind getting the light? That it was prohibited to record the oral Torah, just as it was prohibited to recite the written Torah by heart. Next week, in the class about the Talmud, we're going to explore why it was permissible to write it. Now, even in the time that it was handed down orally, it doesn't mean that there was no writings. They would write in code, they would write in shorthand, just that the ideas were there. But then at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, as we're going to learn next week, it was mandated that it should be written. So that was during the Mishnaic era. That was at the time after the destruction of the Second Temple. It was before the final dispersion of the Jews out of Israel, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, that he took upon himself to record the summation of Jewish law, and he wrote it in the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And that was at the time that they also read the Midrash. Now, we're going to reiterate this again. The Talmud is the most important work of the oral Torah, but it's not exclusive. Maimonides puts it in a beautiful way and says that whatever was written in the Talmud was universally binding on the Jewish community, no matter where they were. Because when the Talmud was concluded, there were only 2 centers of Jewish life where Jewish people lived. They either lived in Israel, the remnants of the Jews that were in Israel, or they were in Babylonia. So you had the Babylonian Talmud and you had the Jerusalemite Talmud, as we're going to discuss next week. After the Talmud's conclusion, Jews were dispersed in many, many different places. So therefore, laws or edicts, I shouldn't say laws, customs and edicts that were put in place were only binding on those particular communities. It wasn't binding anymore universally. So therefore, the Talmud has an authority that no one else has, and this applies to the Midrash as well. Okay? Now, the Midrash not only contains halacha, as we said, it contains stories, narratives, parables with mystical secrets. We're going to actually do one mystical parable that the Midrash says, if you go to page 64. Okay. We're going to start with that text number 2. This is taken from the Midrash Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah is a collection of midrashim according to the 5 books of Moses and some of the other books. It is the most common and popular part of the Midrash. And over there in Midrash Rabbah on the book of Genesis, it says the following. When iron was created, the trees started trembling. Said iron to them, why are you trembling? If no tree among you enters into me, in other words, to provide a handle for my blade, not a single one of you will be hurt. So first of all, we know that parables is an age-old method of teaching concepts. But over here, it's coming to tell us some idea which is so powerful. And think about it for a moment. Iron was created, and iron is the natural enemy of wood, of trees. It can chop trees. So it makes sense that the trees are worried and the trees start to tremble. What does iron say to the tree? Iron says to the tree, what?
I can't be there without you.
I can't be there without you. If you let me in and you make me part of you, then I have influence on you. The Medrash is giving a secret code to the Jewish community. If you look at the history of the Jewish community, of all the horrors and catastrophes that we went through in the hands of the enemies, in every case, there was always a portal that allowed the enemy in to the Jewish community to destroy the Jewish community. And that was the Jewish people themselves. I'm not blaming the Jews, I'm just saying it's a fact. If you give a look at the time of the Romans or the time of the Greeks, it was the same thing. They invited them in, and then once they invited them in, it was too late to put the genie back into the bottle. and then the destruction happened. Even in the Holocaust, which I don't want to dwell much on, the Nazis knew that the best way for them to expedite their plan is by employing Jews in their master plan. And they had the Judenrat, and then in the camps they had the Kapos. And they were the ones that facilitated the ability to murder more Jews. In every level, it's like that, and we don't have to dwell on it. But the Medrash, instead of saying it out in explicit ways, which can anger all the nations of the world, it gives it in the form of a parable. Who's that crossing it out? I don't know who that was. We've been hacked. Okay.
I thought it was a parable from the Matthew.
I only noticed it once it came up. Most of the esoteric wisdom of the Torah is hidden now. So for that reason, you have parables. Parables also sometimes can take something which is the most abstract and allow it to actually be conveyed, because without that, you may not be able to take the item and convey it because it's in the abstract. And when something is in the abstract, you need to have a parable in order to explain it. There are many parables that the Midrash says, which the purpose of the parable is to try to convey something that is hidden. And we're going to see some examples. Now, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of V'yadi, makes a fascinating statement if you look at text 3. And he says the following: most of the esoteric wisdom of the Torah is hidden in the Agadot, which have been compiled in the book of Ein Yaakov. And the reason that he says this is the following: there are many people that are great scholars. So when they're learning the Talmud, they only want to learn the legal aspect of the Talmud. So the legal discussions and the debates, which are so deep, that's something which they find that it's useful. But they have no time for all these little stories or interpretations. And actually, the majority of the pages of the Talmud is actually Haggadah. If you take any Talmud and you look through it, you will find that more of the pages are devoted to that. The sages in those days were giving over codes for the centuries in the future to know. Give you a little parable myself before we go on. There's a story told, and I've told the story before, so I ask forgiveness for those that actually heard it before, but it's always a nice parable. There was once a king and queen that didn't have children for many years, and as they aged, God blessed them with a child. The child was brilliant. The child was just really the best that they can be. And the king and queen hired the best tutors, the best teachers for this child. And one day, the king calls in the child and says, I need you to study art, because art will give you a whole different perspective on the world. And he hired the greatest art teachers to him, and he said, promise me that you will continue to study art even after my demise, which the child promised it. There was one big room in the palace that had blank walls. The king hired artists that they should paint murals on the walls, and he gave them specific instructions of what he wanted, and they painted these murals. And the king said to the son, whenever you need to relax or reflect, go into this room, look at the murals and relax, and it'll give you a sense of peace and tranquility and allow you to think things through. Then came the time for the king and queen to depart. They departed. Left instructions of how to run the country. The elders of the country knew that the young man was worthy of becoming the king. He was the crown prince, and eventually he became the king. And he led in a beautiful way, but there was one thing that bothered him. He knew that every king, and he knew this about his father, had amassed treasures, not only their own treasures, but treasures from previous generations as well. And these were priceless gems, priceless works of art, priceless stones and rubies. And look high and low, he couldn't find it. Not only that, there was not one mention in his father's will where he should find these treasures. It was like a total blank. He couldn't understand it. There's something wrong in this picture, he said. It just doesn't make sense. But because he was too busy running the country, So he didn't pay much attention to it. As he was getting older and maturing, he followed his father's ways, and he also kept his promise of learning art, and learning more art, and learning more art, becoming an expert in understanding art, the nuances of art. One time, when he was sitting in this room, this reflective room, he said, it doesn't make sense that my father asked to paint this room, that this should be the place for me to reflect. I could have gone to the garden and reflected there. What is it that he wanted me to see on these walls? And he realized that there is a secret hidden in the paintings. And he began to look at the paintings day after day, until, because of his great wisdom in art, he noticed an imperfection in one of the walls. And he said, it doesn't make sense that these great artists actually made this imperfection. Now, an ordinary person that would look at art would never notice it. Even other artists would notice it. Only someone that was really trained in art that would be able to notice this imperfection. And he thought, and he said, this is it. This imperfection has to be explored. He took a hammer and a chisel, and he began to chisel behind the wall. And sure enough, that's where he found the safe with the codes with the entire treasures. And he realized that his father wanted him to mature, that he should be able to discover the secret rather than doing it as a young person, and then he might waste away his whole wealth or not appreciate what these treasures are. The same thing is true with the Midrash. The Midrash is not something that you can just learn on a literal level. You have to understand that there are codes that are there. And the more you study it, the more you begin to realize the secrets that the sages are telling you, just as the story that we mentioned before. So we're going to look at a very weird, bizarre Midrash. And it's also taken from Bereshit Rabbah. And we're gonna read it. And then I'm gonna ask anyone, whether you're in the live audience or whether you're on Zoom, to please see if you can make sense of what it says. There's a big question. When God created the world, there were no human beings. So when God said, let us make man, whom was he consulting with? So the Midrash says the following. Said Rav Simon, he was consulting with the angels. When God came to create the first human being, the ministering angels formed different factions, different parties. Some of them said the human being shall not be created, while others said the human being should be created. Thus it is written in the book of Psalms, kindness and truth encountered each other, righteousness and peace abutted. Kindness said, create them, for they do acts of kindness. And truth said, do not create them, as they're full of lies. Righteousness said, create them, for they do acts of righteousness. Peace said, do not create them, as they're full of quarrels. What did God do? He took truth and hurled it to the earth. Thus it is written in the book of Daniel, you cast truth to the ground. Said the ministering angels to God, Master of the world, why do you insult your signet? The sign of God is truth. In fact, the Hebrew word emet covers the entire alphabet. Aleph, Mem, Tav. Aleph is the first letter, Mem is at the center, Tav is at the end. So God said, may truth rise from the earth. Thus it is written, truth sprouts forth from the earth. Okay. What is the Medrash trying to tell us? Medrash is not just wasting ink. The Medrash is not just looking for interpretations of verses. This Midrash actually is a very important Midrash. And what comes to your mind? I can tell you it could take a lifetime to try to discover what this Midrash says. I promise you we're going to come to the end of this class and we'll have the answer. So if you really want to know the answer to this Midrash, you have to stay till the end. But it has to do something with truth and peace. Okay? Nevertheless.
Here's a question.
Yes.
You have a question? I've got a question for you. Man was created from the earth. Man was
I'll repeat the
created-
question for the people.
Okay, man was created from the earth. And truth was thrown to the earth, and then he rose from the earth.
Didn't rise yet. Let me just say the question. The question is being asked is, as man was created to the earth, truth was thrown to the earth, and then truth will come up again, but it didn't come up yet. Actually, it does come up sometimes. This concept that truth sprouts forth from the earth is a statement that has been repeated in Judaism many, many times, that eventually the truth will come out. It's a very, very famous statement. The truth eventually comes out because a lie cannot last long. The word for lie in Hebrew is sheker, and sheker stands on the kuf. It stands on one leg. And the old Jewish adage is, you can't stand on one leg for a very long time. So eventually lies fall apart. And everybody knows that when somebody lies, the lie eventually is exposed, the truth comes out. The question is, why did God hurl the truth on the ground? And one of the things that come to mind, but we will see it a little bit later, is that God was honest about the ability for the world to be able to exist. And that is that if you have the two values intersecting, truth and peace, which should be the dominant value, truth or peace? Think about it. Let's say you have somebody in the family that if you tell them some gossip about what someone else said about them, they'll be very hurt and they'll never be able to live again in a normal way, right? So you have a choice. I have to be truthful. You got to know the truth, no matter what the consequences are, even though it hurts them and destroys them forever. Or you say, peace is more important. Ignorance is bliss. I would rather not tell them. That's one of the things that we learn from it. The world is a world that is a false world. It's all about, why is this world a false world? Because the value system is all screwed up. We value materialism over spirituality. We value physical over godliness. We see that from how much time we invest in the physical. Physical is here today, gone tomorrow. It's transitory. It leaves, it doesn't stay forever. The only thing that's permanent is godliness and spirituality. But yet, people are always impressed. That person looks nice, or that person is wearing nice garments. They have a nice house. They have a nice car. We value that, and we sort of evaluate the person based on things that are not really real. But there are things that are much more important, like character, godliness within a person. So we'll get to that midrash in a fascinating way at the very end of the class and see what it is. But this is just an example. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, does anyone else have any questions before I go on? Okay. So what I want to do is go to the something very interesting, the methodology. Now, one of the things we learned in JLI in the past was that when you talk about principles that Moses handed down, those principles themselves are used in exploring the Torah, whether it's halacha or the deeper levels of the Torah. And we're going to have some examples. So let's look at text number 5 on page 68. It says in the big Midrash, Midrash Hagadol, on the book of Exodus, when God gave the Torah to Moses, there's an entire portion that starts with the word mishpatim. Ve'ela mishpatim asher tasim lefneim. These are the laws you shall place before them. In other words, before the Jewish people, God says Moses. Rabbi Yishmael says, Rabbi Yishmael was one of the very famous Tanaim and authors of the Mishnah. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. He was a Kohen Gadol as well. And unfortunately, he was killed by the Romans. And we recite the story of his death in the Yom Kippur liturgy. Very famous personality in the Mishnah. So he says these are the 13 methods by which the Torah is expounded, which were given to Moses at Sinai. In fact, so important are these 13 methods that they are recited every morning in the morning service. Before we say Holy, we say Rabbi Shmuel, Amma B'Shloshes Midres HaTorah Nidreshes. There are 13 tools through which the Torah is Nidreshes, is learned. And it goes on to say, we're going to choose 4 today as samples. And these 4 are actually something which are quite fascinating. And we're going to, if you give a look at the screen, and you also have it, the illustration chart in your book on page 69. And if it's easier to look at the screen, it's better. So you have number 1, which is called Kal V'chomer. Kal V'chomer literally means that you learn the lighter out of the heavier. In English or Latin, it's called the a fortiori. We're going to see some examples of that. The second one is called Ribuy Amiyut, which is textual exposition. And the third one is association, Hekesh. And the third one is alternate readings of how to read the text. Now, there are 13, but we're not going to sit here all night. We're going to do 4. And these 4 actually are quite interesting. It doesn't have to be very legal, but at least it gives us a little bit of an idea. Yes.
I have a question. As far as you're saying for this would be when you get up in the morning and go and wake up every day, go to bed and wake up, you say the prayers, but you don't. I mean, I'm not gonna say people don't see it or feel it, but as far as that, is that considering part of one of the blessings? As far as the feelings?
Okay, so let me repeat the question. When I say the prayer, well, I mentioned this, we say the prayers in the morning. Let me just repeat the question. When I say the prayers, do I feel it? So we're not talking about the morning blessings right now. I was saying that in the liturgy of the prayer, this concept of exploring the Torah through the 13 methods or principles are so important that in order to remind ourselves the method, the sages instituted that we should recite it every day. And from those 13, we're taking 4. Now, I want to put the background to this 4. This is actually not even a very difficult legal thing. This is going to be very simple. Then we'll get to the legal thing. Not long ago, we read about the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? So it's the story of Joseph and the brothers. Joseph accused his brothers of being spies. Now, remember, they're the ones that sold him into slavery. And they came to Egypt looking for him, but they did not recognize him because when he was sold into slavery, he was a young lad and he looked like a child. Now he was a full-grown man with a big beard and he looked royal, wearing royal Egyptian garb. So they couldn't recognize him. So what happens is that after they're there to buy food to help them during the time of famine, they come back and they see that not only did they get the food, the grains, but all the money that they spent was returned to them. So they became frightened because they might be accused of theft, that they stole it because they didn't pay. So when they came back, the first thing that they said to them was, "What? Here's the money, here's the money. We meant to pay for it." And they assured them, "Don't worry, this was a gift to you, you don't have to worry about it." And then there was a plot that Joseph had against his brothers, and that was by planting the silver goblet that was very precious to him in the sack of his youngest brother, Benjamin, who was also his mother's brother from his mother's son. And as they left town, he sent agents to pursue them, saying, "Why are you stealing my goblet?" They didn't know anything about it. And of course, they found the goblet. So they were all brought back to the palace. And he said, "How dare you do such a thing, especially with a person like me?" So what was their response? Give a look on page 70, text 6. What was their response? "Behold, the money that we found in the opening of our bags," in other words, from the first time that they came down to Egypt, "we returned to you from the land of Canaan. How then would we steal gold and silver from the house of your master?" In other words, if even the refund that we got we did not want to keep because we thought it's not ours and it belongs to you, and we asked to return it, how much more so would it be that we're not going to steal from you and take gold or silver or goblets from you? So that it means that that's called what's called a kal v'chemer, right? That we learn the heavier from the lighter. Which is lighter? The refund. Which is heavier? Stealing the money. So this concept of kal v'chomer is applied into legal discussion as well. That's what it's called, kal v'chomer. So let's give a look. Here's it's on the board. Logical deduction. If the brothers return the money found in their sacks, certainly they wouldn't steal Joseph's silver goblet, a more severe scenario. Now we're going to see how this affects us in law. This is called the roadside assistance law. Judaism says that when you see someone stuck on the side of the road, you have to stop and help them, unless it's a danger to you. Now, in the olden days, the form of transportation was not your motor vehicle, but it was a donkey. So it says, this is the way it says in the book of Exodus, page 71, text 7. When you see the donkey of your enemy collapsing under its burden, and you are inclined to desist from assisting him, you must assist with him. So let's say you're walking down the street and you see a donkey that is collapsed under the load it's carrying. The Torah is telling you that you're obligated to stop whatever you're doing and help the owner of the donkey unload the donkey's burden so that it can get back on its feet. This is one of the 613 commandments. But what do you find strange about the way the Torah writes this law? Anyone? Read again.
Be positive.
Okay. Anyone have any question on the way the Torah was written? Why doesn't it say, if you go down the road and you see a donkey has collapsed due to its load, you have to help him? Why does it add the word enemy? Question number one. Why does it say also, assist, you must assist him twice? But it doesn't say assist him, it says with him. Okay, so here we have to apply the kal v'chomer. And the kal v'chomer says that if when you see the donkey of your enemy, you must assist him, how much more so when you see a friend? Now, if you were a lawyer and you went strictly by the book, you would say, hey, my enemy I'm supposed to help, but not my friend. My friend I'm not required to do. But if you apply the principle of kal v'chomer, which was given by Moses, so it says, if you have to help an enemy, how much more so when it comes to a friend? The reason the Torah says an enemy is quite obvious, because someone will say an enemy, and I'm not obligated. So the Torah says it doesn't make a difference, but the donkey is not your enemy. And we learn from here the law of Tsar Bali Chaim, that we're not permitted to bring pain to animals or unnecessary pain to animals. The one has to be kind to animals. This is one of the places that we learn it from. Okay. So then there are a few other questions. The other question is, what happens if you're going down and you see two donkeys? One belongs to your friend and one belongs to your enemy. Whom do you do first? Now, we're not asking what you want to do. We're asking what you're obligated to do, right? So there's another text in the Talmud, if you look on page 71, text 8, that says dayo. It's known as the dayo rule. Dayo comes from the word dayenu, means enough. It is enough that the matter derived from the law should be as strong, but not stronger than the source law. Since the source law is the enemy and the derived law is the friend, you have an obligation first to fulfill the source law and then the derived law. So actually, if you have an enemy and a friend, you first have to go to your enemy and then the friend. Now, there is a logical reason for that as well. And the logical reason is because when we do a mitzvah, we're not doing a mitzvah for self-satisfaction. We're doing a mitzvah because we're obligated by God to do so. When do you truly express that you're doing it because God commanded? When you have such a case, such a scenario, when you have two donkeys, and one is a friend that you want to help, and the other one you don't want to help, and you do the one that you don't want to help, then it shows that you're doing the mitzvah because God told you so. That's the whole point. The whole point is if you have the power to only do one, you have to do the first one as to be the enemy. There are other examples as well. Even though it's not brought here, I just want to bring it up. There was a case with Miriam, the sister of Moshe, that it seemed that she said something that could have been interpreted not too friendly to her brother, even though she was totally innocent and she was afflicted with leprosy, right? And she had to go out of the camp. So the question was, how long does she go out? So it says that if someone says something against their father or their elder, they should be put out for a week. So that's why God commanded it should be a week. So the question that the sages ask, an ordinary person that she might have indirectly insulted is a week, but here she went against God's prophet. Shouldn't it be 2 weeks?
Wouldn't it be the rabbi's comment?
1 second. I just want to finish the point, then I'll take your question. So the answer is that you can't, since you're learning it as a Kal Vachomer, you can't do more than the source. So if the source was a week, you can't add more than a week. So everything that you learn through the system of Kal Vachomer can only be as limited as the Kal Vachomer is. It can't be as the original one is. This is very, very important for us to know. But then the Medrash comes along. What was the rabbis had to actually, right, you bring up a very good point. Any of the derived laws couldn't be just recited by one sage and then it was recorded immediately. It's not like here you have the system that you have a federal judge that makes a decision and a ruling, and then it affects the whole system of the federal law. If a reputable sage got up and said Kabbalah, that it was received from the time of Moses, then all discussion would stop. But if a reputable sage got up and he says, this is the way I interpret it, and this is the way I understand it, and it fits with the principles, then it had to be vetted. And it had to be vetted by thousands and thousands of scholars and rabbis to challenge him. And only after it was vetted and voted on was it accepted. So anything that's in a medrash or anything that's in a Talmud, that's the final draft that was written, was vetted by all of these sages. Now we learn another law. If you remember, I asked you, why does it say, assist, you shall assist? Should just say assist, right? Give a look on page 72, text 9. This is already taking the concept of ribui and miut. Ribui and miut means that if the Torah, ribui means increasing, magnifying. If the text says a word twice, that means it's trying to teach you something. If the text is omitting the word, it's also trying to teach you something. So sometimes it'll teach you extra clauses. What are the extra clauses? It says in the verse, assist, you must assist. So that's called ribui. In other words, there's an extra word here. What do we learn from that? So look at page 72, text 9. If one unloaded and reloaded, even 4 or 5 times, one is still obligated to unload again, as it is written, assist, you must assist. So what do we learn from that? Assist means even if it's many times. He's trying again, you must help him. You can't say, help them once, that's enough. But then there is another word. It says, it doesn't say assist, you must assist him. It says assist, you must assist with him. So what does the with him mean? The with him means, give a look further. If the animal's owner is lazy and he walked away and sat down and said, hey, since it's a mitzvah that is incumbent upon you, if you wish to unload, then unload. And he'll go sit down on the side of the road and just have a beer. Then in such a case, you're not obligated because it says with him. So the wording of the written Torah is written in such a specific way, but the Midrash has to come and uncover it, and again, vetted and derived. So this is where we have an example of some of the halachic extrapolations of the verses. Okay, next is, so we have the multiple rounds, and then we have if he walks up or not. The next one, the third one, is what's called the association method, hekesh. Hekesh or gzeira shava or smichut. Hekesh means something which is similar in character. Gzeira shava means that the same word is used in both laws. Now, by the way, all of these learnings can only be by those that have been trained and those that have been accepted by previous generations. It's not like someone comes along today and makes a new law, and you will never find that. And then there's smichut. Smichut means something that is close. So we're now going to go back to the tefillin story. Okay? So when you have two laws that are adjacent to each other or use identical phraseology, we apply what we know from law A to law B. Let's give an example. There is a very famous passage that we recite in Shema every day. This is from the second portion of Shema. Look on page 73, text 10. Very important. This is in the second portion of Shema, which repeats some of the first, but it elaborates. And it says, set these words of mine upon your hearts and upon your souls. Bind them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be phylacteries between your eyes. Teach them to your children to speak of them. Teach them to your children. Then to you to speak of them when you sit in your home and when you travel on the way, and when you lie down and when you rise up. Write them in the doorposts of your home and on your gates. Now, when you think about it, you have 5 mitzvahs, right? 5 mitzvahs. Let's talk about the 5 mitzvahs. Let's look at it again. The first mitzvah is the study of Torah. The second mitzvah is the putting on of the tefillin. But the tefillin is subdivided into 2 mitzvahs, one in the hand and one in the head. The third mitzvah is education, teaching the children. In fact, the whole law of Talmud Torah of teaching the children is learned from this verse, that you have to teach your children. And if you can't teach the children, you have to hire a teacher to teach your children. And then the fourth law is to read the Shema every morning and every evening, when you go to sleep and when you wake up, right? It says, when you go to sleep and when you rise up. And then there's the mitzvah of mezuzah, to write it on the doorpost, okay? But it doesn't describe to us how to do any of this. So let's give a look at the midrashic way. So when you say to bind them on your hand, or put them on your hand, or to put them on your head, okay? Give a look at the picture that you see on page 74, figure 2.4, or you can see it on the board as well. So it says, set these words of mine upon your hearts and upon your souls, bind them as a sign in your hands, and they shall be phylacteries between your eyes. So what does it say in the Medrash, page 75, text 11? This is taken from the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael that we mentioned earlier in the video. So it says, Al Yadcha, on your hand, meaning the upper arm. But perhaps it means literally on the hand. The Torah therefore teaches us by starting the first verse, set these words of mine upon your hearts. That's called smichut, that is right next to it. We're speaking of a place that is aligned with the heart. What is aligned with the heart? The upper arm. That's why when you put it on your arm, it corresponds to your heart. On your hand, this is the left hand. You say that it's the left, perhaps it's the right, but we know from the juxtaposition of the 2 verses, bind them and write them. When you write the mezuzah, just as writing the mezuzah is written with the right hand, if you're a righty, by the way, so is tying the tefillin with the right hand. By the way, if you're a lefty, you put the tefillin on the right hand. I'm a lefty, so I put on my tefillin on the right. I'm the oddball. Most of the people in the synagogue have the tefillin on the left hand. Even though there's another place which also says that it has to be on the weaker hand, but this is one of the other midrashic teachings. Between your eyes, meaning the top of your head. We put it on the top of the head by the hairline. You say it means on top of the head, but perhaps it means literally between the eyes. The Torah therefore teaches us by writing, you are the children of the Lord your God. When it says, do not gash yourself and do not make a baldness between your eyes for the dead. Just as there in the case of the prohibition to tear one's hair out in the morning of dead, the phrase between your eyes means the corresponding spot on top of your head. right? That you can't tear it out as a sign of mourning. So too, the phrase between your eyes in our verse regarding the placement of the tefillin refers to the top of the head. So this is another form of learning. Let's give a look here. This is the method. So the first thing is adjacent text, that since it starts, you shall place them on your heart. And then it says you should put them on your hand. So we learn from that the hand has to correspond to the heart. So therefore we put it on the arm. The other thing is, oops. I don't want to. The other thing is to put it on the tefillin is that of mezuzah. It means that the tefillin should be tied with the same hand that we use to write. The phrase between your eyes is the same thing as in mourning. That's an associated method, so we know that it's where the hair grows. So here we have some examples of how the Midrash extracts and derives the meaning of the Torah. And for this, we know that you can't learn the written Torah without the oral Torah, because the oral Torah gives you the narrative that was given by Moses, how to read the psukim and how to understand it. And finally, we come to something very, very interesting. That is, when you look at a Torah scroll has no vowels. The Torah scroll has no commas, no punctuation, and it doesn't even have the constellations, the trop, the notes, the musical notes. That's why when someone practices to read from the Torah, on the one hand, they're only allowed to read from the Torah, but on the other hand, they have to memorize where to start, where to stop, how to pronounce the words, and how to sing the songs. Punctuation is very important. Have you ever heard of the book Eat, Shoots, and Leaves? Give a look on page 76. Okay. There's a book that's written by a British writer that was very upset by reading these signs along her street when she went to the market of how they would put up signs informing customers, and they just did not know grammar. They did not know how to use the signs. So she says everything is in punctuation. So look at the two pictures. I don't know why they don't have it on the slide, but you have it in the book. The first one is Eat, Shoots, and Leaves. That's an adorable bear, right? Cuddly, that's eating shoots and leaves. But then give a look in the next one. Eats, shoots, and leaves. By putting the comma, it changes the whole meaning. The person is eating, then he gets up and he shoots, and then he leaves. So you have the exact same words with the exact same spelling, and yet it means something else. What does it mean? Every word and sentence in the written Torah can be read and understood in multiple ways. And this uncovers additional layers of meaning of the Torah. So now we have to know how to read it on the simplest level. That's why the sages gave us permission that when you print a Torah book, which was called a Chumash, you should actually put in the vowels, and you should actually put in the punctuation, and you should put in the notes. But when you're reading for the congregation, you can't read from a Chumash. When you're reading from the congregation, you have to read from the authentic Torah scroll. But knowing what it says in the Chumash, you can have an idea how to read it from the Torah scroll. But to say that we're limited to that is impossible. There's a famous story with the Radbaz. The Radbaz was one of the chief rabbi of Egypt from 1517 to 1553. So we have a quote from him on page 78, text 12. He responds to someone that asked him, you asked, why are the vowel marks not written in the Torah scroll, seeing that it was all given to Moses at Sinai? What does it mean? When you look at a Torah scroll, the first words of the Torah are Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earths. Now, since it has no vowels and it has no stops, you could read it any which way you want. I'll give you an alternative way to read it. The first word is Barashit. He created 6. El Hayam, the God of the seas, right? 8, Hashamayim, or you can read it any other way. But nobody reads it that way. Even people that claim that they don't believe in the oral Torah and that the oral Torah is the fiction that was made up by the rabbis, they are lying to themselves, because when they read the Torah, they're reading the Torah exactly the way the oral Torah instructed us to read it. Because the original Torah does not have any vowels. It was handed down by Moshe. But why was it handed down without vowels? It's because there are many meanings. Now, there's no God at the sea, but the Bereshis actually is correct, because Bereshis means that he created the world in 6 days. So there is a hint over there, right? Okay, so he writes the following. Likewise, it would have been fitting that the cantillations, that is the musical notes, the cantillation mark should have been written in the Torah scroll. How much easier it would have been for those bar mitzvah kids when they're reading in the Torah and the notes are right there, right? So that the reader could read smoothly without error. Indeed, the cantillations marks will sometimes explicate the meaning of the text. So what is the answer? It says the letters without the vowels and cantillation marks have numerous meanings, various possible compositions, and even contrary readings. Each and every letter contains facet within facets and mysteries within mysteries. But if the Torah scroll was vowelized, it would be finite and limited, like matter that has been given a definitive form, and it could not be expounded. This is why the sages say there are 70 faces to the Torah. Now, I skipped the reading by mistake, so I want to go back to it for a minute. It goes back. You don't have to turn the page, I'll read it. On page 58, when Jeremiah says, Ukifatish Yufotse Sela, he speaks, God says, my words are like fire and like a hammer that shatters rock. As the hammer explodes many particles, so does one verse of scripture diverge into many meanings. And this is what he's saying over here, that there are many layers to it. And if there were been vowels and notes in the text, we wouldn't have been able to expound in it. So for this reason, we were not permitted to write the vowels and cantillations marks in the Torah, but they are recorded in the Chamashim in keeping with the principle that it is time to act for God, so that the rules of reading of the Torah should not be forgotten as was done regarding the rest of the oral Torah. So here we had 4 different ways of studying the Torah. So 4 of the 13 principles we studied. The first thing was Kal V'chomer, and we used the Kal V'chomer from the story of Joseph and his brothers, and we applied it to the donkey. That if the enemy has to be the donkey of the enemy has to be helped, so much more so the donkey of the friend. But then again, we also have the rule of Dayo that you can't go more than that. Then we had the other lesson, which was Ribuy and Miut. By having extra words or omissions in the Torah, we learn from that other laws. So the fact that it says twice assist, we learned that as many times that he loads and unloads, you have to help him. But the fact that it also says imoy, it doesn't say azav tazav loy, that you should help him, but it says with him means that as long as he's doing the work as well. But if he's lazy and he doesn't want to do the work, now, of course, if somebody is handicapped, they can't do anything, that's a different story. But if the person is totally capable, then they're required to do that. So that was the ribuy and miut. And then we had the hekesh. The hekesh means something which is similar or close by when we learned about the tefillin, that it has to be on the hand and the head. And then we learned also another thing, and that is what we're going to learn now. And that is that the Torah, sometimes by having alternative readings, gives us a deeper meaning, which is like a code that God wants us to know, and we have to be able to extract the code.
Code that you're, is when you have to open the top, at the house or wherever it is, and making sure you pull out and making sure that the mezuzah at the door and making sure it's clean and not falling apart.
You're asking about the mezuzah. So what's the question?
There's a code sometimes when you find out it's not clean. It's not
So
correct.
let's talk about that. That is an interesting question. A mezuzah parchment has to be kosher. What makes it kosher? That A, it's written on parchment. It's not printed on parchment, but it's handwritten. Secondly, that all the letters are there. The letters the way they appear in the Torah. There's not one letter missing, and they also have the proper crowns. If a letter is missing, or if a letter faded, or if a letter cracked, then the mezuzah has to be replaced. So when we check the mezuzahs, we are checking to see. Now with mezuzahs, it'll happen even more with tefillin, even though we checked the tefillin, because mezuzahs, especially the mezuzahs that are on the outside door, can be affected by weather, especially extreme weather. It could be cold and hot, or it could be the sun shining on it. It could be dried out. So that's why we have to check.
How often you need to check?
Huh?
How often?
The common is twice in 7 years, unless you know that it was protected, so you can do it at a more extended time. It was very common for the Rebbe that people would write to the Rebbe for an issue, and the Rebbe, the first thing he would say is, "B'dikat tefillin u'mezuzot." Check your tefillin and the mezuzahs. So, so that's what you're talking about. But anyways, that's something which runs parallel, but we're not really focusing on that. I want to go now.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask one question about a point you were just making? And I just want to make sure I understand.
Absolutely.
Is there greater weight or greater importance? Is it safe to assume that greater importance is placed on the halacha over the parables and the commentary? And the reason why I ask that is part of my second question, which is when we're talking about the instruction in Deuteronomy on how to lay tefillin, for instance, it's very clear, there are very clear instructions, but yet it doesn't, let's say, talk about gender. So how do we know, how do we decipher, and maybe that's just my lack of knowledge, but how do we decipher, how do we pull out that, let's say, that is just the man's responsibility to complete that mitzvah?
It's a very good question. So I want to say that actually the exemption that was given to women of putting on tefillin is not just particularly to tefillin, it's actually to something else. It's a separate discussion, which I would be happy to have with you, but the concept is that any mitzvah that's regulated by time, if you're occupied with another mitzvah, you're exempt of doing it. So for instance, if somebody, it even says that a groom, a man that is getting married is exempt of certain mitzvahs because he's occupied with the mitzvah of marriage. It goes into a whole different discussion. So it's not tefillin it per se, it's those mitzvahs that are regulated to time, except if it has something unique. For instance, the eating of matzah on Pesach, even though it's regulated to time, but because everybody is obligated in celebrating Passover, women are also obligated in eating matzah. The idea of the mitzvah saseh shazman grama, mitzvahs that are relegated to time, that women are exempt, will not say it by tefillin, it would not say it by anything else. It comes from a totally different source, which is discussed in the Talmud in Kiddushin at great, great length. And it applies also to being part of a minyan. It applies to only to a certain amount of mitzvahs, but only those mitzvahs that are relegated to time. I don't want to digress from where we're going, but this is a very good question, and I do believe we should have that discussion. But I would say this, that we have to understand that in Torah, when we're exempt from something, and there are many cases where we're exempt of an obligation because of our obligation in something else, the fact that we're not doing it doesn't mean that we are deficient in that. It means that the other thing that we're doing contains within it the element of this mitzvah that we're exempt from doing, and that's why we don't do it. Like for instance, Rosh Hashanah, we are obligated to blow the shofar. But the Talmud says that if the first day Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat, we're exempt of blowing the shofar. So we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat. But then when you learn in Torah and in Medrash, and especially in Kabbalah, the great virtue and what is accomplished through the blowing of the shofar, that the shofar is not only a call of repentance, but it's also building God's kingdom in the world, and it's bringing about all the revelations that Rosh Hashanah has to bring. So then you say, since I'm not doing it on Shabbat, maybe I'm lacking it. And the answer is that Shabbat already has those elements built in, and that's why on Shabbat you could be exempt. So you have to go from that idea. It's not the mitzvah itself tells you yes or no. There's just general principles that intersect. I hope that helps you for now, and then we will discuss it further. I do want to leave some time for questions, but I promise that we are going to discuss this. We're going to discuss this question that we had before from the Medrash about truth and kindness and justice. So let's see the way it appears in Psalms. You could look on the screen, or you could look in your book, page 79. So the Hebrew words is Yeshev Olam Lefnei Elokim, Chesed ve'emes man yitzaruah. Basically, the psalmist is saying, may he, in other words, the person that's righteous, dwell forever before God. Kindness and truth shall be summoned to guard him. Okay? That's what it means. But if you can read an alternative reading, it can mean something else entirely. Yeshev doesn't mean necessarily that he should dwell. Yeshev also means that he should be settled in a stable way. Olam doesn't only mean forever, Olam also means the world. Man doesn't only mean summons, it also means who. And Yitzaru doesn't only mean guard, but it means to keep it going. Let's give a look on page 80, text 14, to see the alternative reading. Or you could look at the screen as well. We had the first translation, may he forever dwell before God, kindness and truth summoned before him. Or you could read it in an alternate way. May the world be settled before God, who will keep kindness and truth. Now, what does that mean? Let's give a look the way the Medrash tackles it. The Medrash says there was a dialogue between King David and God. Text number 15. Said King David to God, because David is the psalmist and he wrote the Psalms, Master of the world, may the world be settled before you. What does it mean settled? It means balanced. Why don't you balance your world and make equal the rich and poor? Why do you have givers and receivers? Why don't you make everybody equally? This is the equity, equal outcome, right? Why don't you make an equal outcome for everybody? Replied God, if such were the case, who will practice kindness and truth? If all were rich and poor, how would there be an opportunity for human kindness? That's the dialogue, okay? So King David is saying, why is the world so unbalanced? Why can't there be tranquility? And God says, with a perfect world, there would be no opportunities for kindness. I have a question for you. What's wrong with that? Do you have a problem with that? What do I need the kindness for? Let there be tranquility. People want quiet. Everybody is equal. Everybody is living under their garden, their fig tree. Everybody has what to eat. Nobody has to ask anything from anybody else. They're self-sufficient, and it's a fantastic world. Why does God want kindness? Okay? Does anyone have an answer for that? The truth of the matter is that the only way that can be tranquil is if there's nothingness. Think about it. When you want to have a tranquil moment, or you want to have a tranquil week, what do you think? What do you envision?
Nothing, nothingness.
Where do you experience nothingness? You go to a place where you can have nothingness. So sometimes you see travel magazines that try to advertise, go to a secluded beach, and they show you a beach that nobody is there. It's only after you pay the money, you come there, that everybody else wants to be at the secluded beach as well. So everybody's looking for seclusion together. So the truth of the matter is that there's no such thing as truly secluded or truly peaceful. And then again, people that live alone in the wilderness, it takes a toll on them too. There is something there. So the question is, the moment God created the world has friction. Whether it's friction amongst humans or friction amongst animals. Friction amongst animals is the natural way. Animals need to survive, so you have certain animals that are carnivorous and they eat each other, right? Other animals are vegetarian, but basically with humans, as soon as you have a society, there's a friction and there's falsehood. So why is that? So the Medrash is saying something very, very important. When God took truth and threw it to the earth, he was saying that there's something about kindness and righteousness that is greater than even truth. The kindness and righteousness that one does to another really is fulfilling because it brings out purpose, it brings out meaning, and it brings out change, which truth cannot aspire. Truth cannot reach there. In other words, there's a deep spiritual component to it as well, as I'm going to get to in a minute. We're going to finish on a little bit of philosophy, if that's okay with you. Usually the dessert is sweet, but philosophy is also sweet. So we're going to get to that idea in a minute. So when you look at the Medrash, that when truth and peace said, when truth said to God, I can't coexist with peace, what did God do? Said, even though truth is my name, that's my appearance, that's the way I reveal myself, but nevertheless, I cherish peace more than I cherish truth. So I'm willing to take truth and throw it to the ground, but eventually truth will come out. That'll be in the time of Mashiach, when truth and peace will be able to coexist. But until then, he wants kindness and righteousness. The deeds that we do to improve the world, to improve each other, the mitzvahs that we do, the putting on a tefillin, the putting up a mezuzah, the studying Torah, all that is the purpose, because that's what he wants. Now let's take it to a little bit of more of a philosophical level. Every one of us is made up of a body and a soul. And we know that the soul is eternal. That's why the soul is the light of God, as it says in Mishlei. Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The soul of God is the soul, is the candle of God is the soul of the human being. That's why when someone passes away, we don't say that the person doesn't exist. They still exist, but they exist in a spiritual form. Their soul is still there. Not only that, it's no longer bound by the body. So then I'll ask you a question. What is closer to God, the soul or the body?
So,
Why do you say that the soul is closer to God?
I'd say it's more like spiritual in each person.
Because the soul is spiritual in each person. So when you look at a body and a soul, you say that the soul is closer to God. So if someone wants to be closer to God, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to swear off the physical, become totally immersed in the spiritual. And not only that, that's why there were many religions that thought that by secluding themselves or becoming monks, they're closer to God. Comes along Judaism, and that's what's found in this statement that you find on the board. Comes along Judaism and says, absolutely not true. The reverse is true. The body is much closer to God than the soul. How would you say that? So if you argue with someone that says that the soul is closer to God, he will say, I agree that you need the body because without the body, you can't do the mitzvah. The body is the actual, does the physical mitzvah that God commanded in the Torah. The soul can't do that. So the body is a tool through which the soul can do the mitzvah. But to say that the body is closer to God than the soul, can't accept it. But the truth of the matter is that the body is much closer to God than the soul. Now, in order to discover that the body is closer to God than the soul, you need the soul for that. Just 1 second. You can join, but not distract. So because we're in the middle of an akuda right now. So let's go over this again. Conventional wisdom will tell you that the body is distant and the soul is close to God. We're coming along and saying that the body is actually closer to God than the soul. It's the soul, but the soul has to reveal it because the body on its own is very physical. It's very material. As we said before earlier in the class, it's transitory. It's here today, gone tomorrow. So therefore, there's no real value to it. The soul understands the value of the body, but what does the soul understand? The soul understands that the whole purpose of creation was not only for the soul, because the soul is also created, but was for the body. Where does God dwell? Where does God say, make me my garden and make the place where I can be, is only in this physical world. That the whole purpose of the creation of all the upper worlds and the higher worlds and all of the great angels and everything else was only for this world here, that we should be able to do the physical mitzvah, which that is the concept of the kindness. The truth says there's two levels of truth. That there's a truth, which is the way it's divine intelligence that says the soul is closer to God. But the truth of God says something different. Let's see how the Rebbe brings it out. The Rebbe brings it out in such a beautiful way. And this is the final reading for the night. You give a look, text 16, page 82. A very powerful statement from the Rebbe. The Rebbe takes this midrash and he talks about it, and he says that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, an hour before he passed away, he wrote a letter, and the letter was about this medrash. And the Rebbe explains it. And here's what the Rebbe says. The attribute of truth, which is the truth of God as it relates to the spiritual process of creation, where there's a higher and a lower, and the soul is higher than the body, is limited in that it only manifests itself within where the divine truth is recognized. So because the material world is a place of falsehood, a place where the divine truth is not recognized, the attribute of truth says, do not create. I don't want the physical world. It's the lowest of low. And they're right on that perspective, right? The soul is higher. The body just tarnishes the soul. But the quintessential truth of God is not constrained in any way. It is not limited to those places where the divine truth is recognized. So where is God's desire? God's desire is a physical world. Therefore, even a person's mundane household affairs, in which a person engages solely for materialistic purposes, and which therefore seem to be a pack of lies that have no connection with the truth of God, these are also bound to the divine reality. This expresses itself when the person, despite the fact that they experience only the materialistic nature of these pursuits, utilizes them for goodness and holiness. So if someone works, and they work very hard to earn money, and they say, with this I can buy a nice house and I can buy a nice car, but they also realize that part of the money they have to do kindness with, they have to give tzedakah. So then they're doing the full purpose of what God wanted. They're elevating the physical to its ultimate purpose. And they're recognizing that the ultimate purpose of why God created the world was to reveal in this world of strife, peace and kindness. That is the ultimate challenge. So what we're learning here is a fantastic thing of this medrash. What was the dialogue between God and David? David says, let everybody be equal. We don't need kindness. And God says, if we didn't have kindness, I wouldn't create the world. The whole purpose of the creation of the world is to take the dark world and transform it into light. To take this dark world and make it beautiful. And I want to say it's actually connected to tonight, which is the 10th of Shvat, because the Rebbe would always recite a discourse based on his father-in-law's discourse for this day. And over there he said 2 words. He said in building the sanctuary for God, they had to use beams, wooden beams. The wooden beam in Hebrew is called a keresh. Keresh is a beam. But he said if you take the same 3 letters of keresh, kuf, resh, shin, and you juxtapose it, you change it around, it spells the word sheker. Sheker means false. What God wanted was that we should take the falsehoods of this world and transform it and make it into a beam that connects us with God, which brings us to the 3rd meaning of this word, which is also spelled with the same 3 letters, kuf, shin, resh, kesher. It binds us with God. That the ultimate desire of God, of why he created this universe, and why he created people, and why he created animals, and why he created the plant life, and why he created everything that he created, was that this should become a divine place for him. And the only way that this can become a divine place is when there's kindness that's done. And that's why he created inequality in the world, that we, the humans, should bring help to each other. Now, I want to say one more thing to quote the Talmud, And that is, that is, the Talmud says that as much as the giver is giving to the receiver is giving much more to the giver on many levels. So when a person is giving tzedakah or a person is giving kindness to another person, they shouldn't see it that I'm the giver and you're the receiver. They should say, you are giving me the opportunity to fulfill my purpose, and without you, I couldn't fulfill that purpose. So you're giving me something that without you, I wouldn't have had it, and therefore I have to celebrate it. And that is what the meaning of that statement is. So then you take the same statement in Tehillim, you can read it one way, you read it the other way, and it opens up a whole new vista. So we learned a little bit of what the Midrash is, and the parables of the Midrash are not there to give you some fairy tales. The parables of the Midrash is to teach you tremendous lessons. We don't have time in the hour and a half to go through every parable, but every and any parable of the Midrash that you will see, there is a hidden lesson there that is abstract, that he's trying to reveal to you, just like that prince, that young prince, when he looked at the imperfection, was able to find the treasures, we're able to find the treasures as well. Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to learn about the Talmud and the Halachic. Yes, any questions? I'm not going offline, so anyone that has questions, please feel free to ask questions.
If you have any questions for those that going through the book during the week, have questions about the lesson?
Yes, anyone that has questions during the week can email me or talk to me. Thank you very much. This was wonderful. We will see you with God's help next week. Oh, one chat. Let's see the chat.
Okay.
Thank you. Sure. Let me just.
Okay, you're right.